Beneath the dust of forgotten counties and the rotting beams of collapsed homes lies a silence too heavy to ignore. It is the silence of a family no one dares to name aloud, the kind of silence that swallows entire generations and erases them from the living memory of America. A family that did not vanish through violence or war, but through something far more disturbing, something that crept quietly within their blood, binding them tighter until there was nowhere left to go but deeper into themselves. What happens to a family when bloodlines no longer branch, but coil in on themselves like a snake devouring its own tail? What does history do with such people? Does it remember them, or does it bury them under layers of shame, waiting for the earth to seal away their secrets forever? Tonight, we drag that silence into the light. The most inbred family in America was not noble, not royal, not shielded by gilded walls. They lived among us, hidden in plain sight, in places where neighbors rarely asked questions and outsiders never stayed long. Their existence is unsettling not only because of what it reveals about human nature, but because it forces us to face the truth. History forgets what it cannot bear to remember. And when you look at this family, you begin to understand why. Every face, every story, every fragment that survives carries with it a heaviness that does not fade. Some call it tragedy, others horror. But for the family themselves, it was simply life as they knew it. When outsiders stumbled upon them, the reports are always the same. Something was wrong. Not wrong in the way a stranger might seem odd or unusual, but wrong in the way that makes your stomach twist before your mind even catches up. Their eyes, their speech, their movements, even the air around them. It all told a story of isolation so severe that the human body itself began to break under its weight. And yet, these people were not monsters. They were not villains. They were victims of geography, poverty, and time. Victims of a legacy handed down through no choice of their own. And still, history whispers about them as if they were some forbidden secret better left untouched. So the question remains, what will history do with the memory of the most inbred family? Will it erase them as an embarrassment, a blemish on the American dream? Or will it leave them lurking in the shadows, a quiet reminder that the line between civilization and collapse is far thinner than we like to believe? The story begins, as so many American tragedies do, with isolation. Families who moved far into the hills or into valleys where roads were nothing more than muddy veins cutting through the wilderness. Places where winters cut communities off for months, where children grew up knowing only the faces of their kin, and where survival was measured not in wealth or ambition, but in whether you could endure another season of hunger and cold. In these forgotten corners, the rest of the world disappeared. No schools, no churches, no markets, no laws, just blood, carried from parent to child, passed on like an heirloom that grew more fragile with every generation. It is here that the foundation of the family was set, not through deliberate sin or planned corruption, but through circumstance. Cousins marrying cousins because there were no strangers to court, brothers and sisters bound not only by walls, but by necessity, and with each generation, the choices narrowed, until choice itself was gone. This is not the kind of story history books want to tell, because it doesn't fit into the tidy categories of morality or progress. It is uglier than that, messier, quieter, more terrifying because it feels inevitable. Those who first documented the family never used their real names. Reports were often buried or disguised as case studies of genetic decline and social degeneration. To speak plainly about them was to invite scandal, and so their story lived in whispers and anonymous reports filed away in forgotten archives. But every once in a while, a traveler would stumble into their world, a salesman, a social worker, a police officer, and each account is a window into something unspeakable. They tell of children who struggled to form words, of men and women whose faces bore the unmistakable marks of bloodlines turned inward, of entire households that seemed caught in a loop of endless repetition, unable to escape the cycle of their own making. Yet when you strip away the clinical language, when you set aside the moral judgments, what you are left with is something far more disturbing. A family who lived and breathed just like yours, but who were trapped in a system they could not escape. They laughed, they ate, they prayed, they fought. And still, behind every moment of daily life, was the unspoken weight of history pressing down upon them. History had already decided what they were allowed to become, and what they would never be. Those who dared to look closer often described a kind of atmosphere that lingered in the family's presence. It was not just what they saw, it was what they felt, a suffocating stillness, as though time itself had slowed to a crawl inside their world. Neighbors whispered that even the trees seemed to lean away from the house, that animals refused to linger near their property. When visitors approached, they were greeted not with conversation, but with silence, stares that lingered a little too long, faces that revealed both recognition and emptiness, as if generations of repetition had hollowed out something essential in them. One account describes a young boy standing barefoot in the mud, unable to speak, only able to make guttural sounds, while his sister stood behind him, watching, never saying a word. Another speaks of men with twisted features who would sit on the porch for hours, rocking, mumbling, staring into the distance as though waiting for something that never came. These images are not inventions of horror. They are the fragments left behind by those who stumbled into a reality most would rather deny. But what makes their story truly haunting is not the grotesque details. It is the realization that none of them chose this path. They were not the architects of their suffering, but the inheritors of it. In a world where opportunities narrowed to nothing, what could they have done? Where was there to go? Who would welcome them beyond the borders of their hidden valley? Every attempt to escape was met with the crushing force of poverty, stigma, and shame. So, they stayed, they repeated, they endured. And in that endurance, something remarkable and unsettling happened. They became invisible, not in the literal sense, but in the way history erases what it cannot understand. Government officials ignored them, records left them nameless, and society turned its head. That they were not the kind of people America wanted to admit it had created, so they slipped between the cracks, existing in a liminal space between recognition and erasure. Too disturbing to remember, too real to completely forget. In the photographs that survive, grainy, black and white, often captured without their consent, you see faces that force you to look twice, faces that carry the weight of centuries in a single glance, faces that tell a story words cannot. And it is here in these images that the line between human empathy and quiet horror begins to blur. As generations passed, the consequences of this closed circle grew heavier. Bodies weakened, minds fractured, and yet the family line continued stubbornly, as though sheer survival was their only inheritance. Every child born into that house carried not only the features of their parents, but the compounded marks of ancestors whose blood had nowhere else to go. It was not just resemblance, it was repetition, the same faces reappearing again and again, like echoes trapped inside a chamber with no way out. Scientists would later call it genetic bottlenecking, a collapse of variation that leaves only fragility behind. But in that household, it wasn't theory, it was lived reality. Children struggled with speech, with coordination, with thoughts that never fully formed into words. And those who could not speak learned other ways of communication, grunts, gestures, sounds that unsettled outsiders, but carried deep meaning within the family itself. What looked like chaos from the outside was, in truth, a private language born of necessity, a way for them to understand each other when the rest of the world refused to understand them. But even as their blood betrayed them, their humanity remained. They still gathered around meals, still shared stories in their own broken ways, still looked after one another when sickness spread through the home. They were not monsters, they were kin, bound by ties that neither cruelty nor abandonment could sever. And that may be the most haunting part of all. Love still existed in that house, a warped, trapped kind of love, but love nonetheless. Yet the outside world saw only horror. Journalists who caught wind of their existence used words like freakish, abominations, subhuman. They stripped them of dignity, turning their suffering into grotesque entertainment for distant readers who would never set foot near their land. These families became sideshow myths, cautionary tales whispered in classrooms, their humanity buried under layers of mockery and disgust. What the world refused to face was the truth. They were not creatures of nightmare. They were what happens when a nation forgets its most vulnerable, when isolation and neglect become as binding as any chain. And so the question deepens. When history tells their story, will it remember them as people or as warnings, as bloodlines doomed by their own choices, or as victims of a silence America itself created? By the middle of the 20th century, whispers of the family had begun to leak beyond their valley. Social workers, journalists, even law enforcement would occasionally cross the threshold of their world, and each encounter left behind fragments of testimony that added fuel to the legend. But the reports varied wildly. Some painted the family as dangerous, unpredictable, and best left alone. Others described them as docile, even kind, though deeply scarred by the weight of their condition. The truth, as always, was more complex than either narrative allowed. Visitors often remarked on the dissonance. Children who could not speak would smile at strangers with a gentleness that disarmed them. Men whose faces bore the unmistakable imprint of inbreeding would offer food or help without hesitation. And then there were moments that unsettled even the most hardened observers. Fits of sudden violence, screams that echoed through the night, or the eerie way entire groups would fall silent when outsiders approached, as if rehearsed. These contradictions made the family impossible to categorize. They were neither wholly victim nor villain, neither fully tragic nor monstrous. They existed in a grey space that history finds deeply uncomfortable. It was around this time that photographs began to surface, each one carrying the weight of a secret never meant to be shared. The images were not flattering, they were not staged, they were stark, clinical glimpses into a reality few wanted to admit existed, and yet, those who saw the photographs could not look away. Something in the eyes of the subjects seemed to reach out across the decades, demanding recognition even as the world recoiled. And here lies the paradox. The more the family was revealed, the more people wished they had never known. Communities surrounding them feared exposure, not because they wished to protect the family, but because they dreaded the shame it reflected back onto them. To acknowledge the family was to admit that such suffering had been allowed to exist for generations within walking distance of modern America. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed in silence or tried to break free? The further we go into this story, the harder it becomes to distinguish between what the family was and what the world made of them. And in that tension lies the reason history keeps trying to bury their memory. As the decades wore on, the family became less of a presence and more of a shadow. Neighbors whispered their name with lowered voices, children were warned never to wander too close, and yet curiosity always pulled people back to the edges of their property. The myth of the family had begun to outgrow the reality. Outsiders arrived not to help, but to stare, to confirm rumors, to satisfy a morbid fascination with lives so unlike their own. The family, once invisible, was now trapped in the cruel spotlight of exploitation. Journalists returned again and again, some under the pretense of study, others openly seeking spectacle. Their pens carved the family into grotesque caricatures, stripping away every layer of dignity and leaving only horror for readers to consume. Photographs were published without consent, faces exposed to the world as if they were curiosities in a museum of deformities. These were not portrayals of people, but of symbols, symbols of what happens when bloodlines are left to rot in silence. And with each telling, the humanity of the family was buried deeper, smothered beneath sensationalism. But behind the cruel fascination lay a truth even harder to face. The family had endured longer than anyone expected. They lived on, not because their lives were easy, but because they had no choice. The cycle of birth and repetition continued, each new child another reminder of the past that refused to fade. And yet, in the midst of this endless loop, small moments of resilience glimmered through the darkness. Family members who cared for one another with tenderness, siblings who shielded each other from ridicule, elders who still clung to rituals of faith or memory that stretched back generations. Even in their fractured state, they carried pieces of what it means to be human. Still, America preferred the myth over the reality. It was easier to reduce them to warnings, to freakish cautionary tales, than to confront the brutal questions they raised. How many other families were lost to the same forces, poverty, isolation, neglect, without ever being noticed? How many more lived and died in silence, unrecorded, because no one cared enough to look? And so the family remained suspended between memory and forgetting, trapped not only by their own blood, but by the narratives forced upon them. A legacy both unwanted and unforgettable, too disturbing to preserve, yet too haunting to fully erase. Now we stand at the edge of their story, asking what history will truly do with the memory of the most inbred family. Will their faces remain locked in the grainy photographs that circulate in whispers online, condemned to be viewed as sideshow horrors? Or will their lives, stripped of dignity in life, be granted even a fragment of it in death? The danger of forgetting is not that we erase them entirely, but that we erase the lessons they leave behind. Because their suffering was not born of choice, it was born of abandonment. They were left to wither, left to repeat, left to collapse into themselves because no one came to break the cycle. When we look back, we prefer to place blame solely on bloodlines, to convince ourselves this was inevitable, that it could not have been otherwise, but the truth is darker. Their isolation was manufactured by neglect, their poverty was ignored, their humanity was denied, and so what began as survival slowly became pathology, until generations later their very existence seemed unrecognizable to the rest of the world. That is not only their tragedy, it is ours. If history forgets them, it will be because remembering demands too much of us. It demands that we acknowledge the fragility of civilization, how quickly the thin fabric of community can unravel into silence and decay. It demands that we see the faces in those photographs not as curiosities, but as reflections of what happens when society abandons its most vulnerable. And perhaps that is why so many prefer the forgetting. To remember them is to confront ourselves. In the end, the most haunting truth is that the family never asked for their story to be told. They did not seek out the world's attention, nor did they invite the judgment that came with it. They simply existed, bound by the circumstances of their birth, living out lives that should have been their own to define. What history chooses to do with that existence will reveal less about them and more about us, because if we erase them, we erase the evidence of how cruel neglect can become. And if we remember them, we inherit the burden of their suffering, a reminder that silence and abandonment are just as lethal as any weapon. So perhaps the real question is not what history will forget about the most inbred family, but what we will choose to remember, and whether, when the silence finally settles, we will dare to say their names aloud, or let them remain buried in the shadows forever.